is probably the question of primary importance. As we think back over this story that we just read, this story called The Passion, probably one of the oldest stories that the Christian community began to tell about Jesus. As we think back over the one we just read from the Gospel of Mark, we encounter many different perspectives on who Jesus is. And each perspective drives how that person responds to Jesus and to the situation around him. Judas, who some say was a member of the Zealot party, that was a party who looked for the political defeat of Rome, may have expected Jesus to be the one that they had waited for, the Messiah who would finally overturn the Roman Empire and retake that land for the kingdom that was rightly the Hebrew kingdom. If so, Judas would have been gravely disappointed by the direction that Jesus took. And perhaps that's why he betrayed him. Peter's devoted to Jesus. He wants him to succeed. And we read not too many weeks ago about how Peter had tried to talk Jesus out of continuing along this path, which everyone knew very well would eventually lead to his destruction. Peter feared for Jesus' life. He probably also feared for the life of the movement that Jesus had begun. And maybe, although he was adamant that he would stay with Jesus unto the death, maybe he was a bit afraid for his own life as well. After all, we know that Peter did have a family, a wife, a mother-in-law, probably children. For Peter, Jesus was the Messiah who would bring everything to fulfillment. But did that really include losing the life that he, Peter, had? So when things got dangerous, Peter got scared, and he denied even knowing him. For the high priest, Jesus appeared to be a threat to the religious tradition that the high priest had sworn to uphold, sworn before God to uphold. A threat to the tenuous relationship that existed between the Jews and the Roman Empire. Jesus loved to use subversive language, saying things like, "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last." Jesus attracted people who were not of the mainstream of society and culture, and it seemed like he was attracting more and more and more of them. Jesus was dangerous to everything that was established and to everyone who had a place in that establishment. With that understanding of Jesus, no wonder the high priest condemned him. Pilate was ambivalent towards him. Pilate was curious enough about him to question him and even to listen to the answers. Curious enough to have some second thoughts about carrying out the sentence against him. But Pilate's second thoughts were not very strong. He had no real commitment to those thoughts, especially not when public opinion was going the other way. So Pilate handed him over. Each of these people had a particular way of experiencing who Jesus was for them. And their experience made a huge difference in the choices that they made. This brings us, of course, to the central issue for each one of us, which is, who is Jesus, this one whom we call the Christ? Who is Jesus for you? And who is Jesus for me? And what difference does our experience of Jesus make in our own lives? For me, Jesus is both the face of God, as God desires to be known, and the face of human life, as God intends human life to be lived. Now Certainly that isn't news to anybody. That's the Orthodox saying and what we say in the Creed every Sunday. But as I begin to look at what that really means for me, what that really means for Jesus to be that face of God where God makes himself known, and to be that face of humanity where we see what you and I are really intended to be. As I begin to look at that face that reveals what God is like, I see in Jesus that God is somewhat different from many of the perspectives that I hear about, and from many of the perspectives that I have at one time in my life held to. I see this difference all the way throughout all the Gospels, but in the Passion narrative, I especially see this particular difference. When I look at what happens to Jesus in this story of his rejection and his humiliation, his beating and his execution, when I look at that, I see a God who operates very differently from the idea that many people have. I see a God who operates very differently from the idea of one who rewards the good and punishes the bad. If we look at Jesus, obviously this is not a story about God punishing him. Not any more than God is punishing us when we suffer grief or loss or poor health or death in this life. You know, I always just want to cry when someone who falls ill comes to me and is trying to figure out what they've done wrong to now have this disease. I always just want to cry when someone sees a very good young man die young and a wretched man live to a ripe old age. I just want to cry when they're asking, why did God do that? Why did God take the good man and leave that other fellow here? I want to cry because none of those situations, none of them speak of the God we see in Jesus. Because the God we see in Jesus does not send illness as punishment or pluck someone out of this world on a whim. The God we see in Jesus goes where the brokenness of this world already is, whether that be the brokenness of illness or death or injury or even condemnation. And wherever that brokenness is, the God we see in Jesus walks through it with the person who suffers, bringing to that person and everyone around them healing in whatever way is possible. And when healing in this world is no longer a viable possibility, and for all of us someday that is the truth, that healing in this world is not a viable possibility. When that is the case, then the God I see in Jesus heals through death itself. Because as one old Anglican prayer says, in death life is changed, not ended. This is something of what the face of Jesus shows me about God. But also the face of Jesus shows me something about you and me, especially in this Passion narrative. Especially as we look in this Passion narrative at the ways in which Jesus moves through the events of the week. Because as he moves through the events of that week, the face of Jesus shows us something of what it looks like to live life freed from a preoccupation with that ego self. In these events, Jesus' focus is always on responding to the moment at hand and then moving on. He doesn't get all caught up in trying to impress anyone or to justify his actions or to explain himself. He speaks out when he needs to speak. He remains silent when no words are necessary. Although it's not included in Mark's account, and certainly in the other accounts of the Passion, we see him, even in the midst of his suffering, reaching out in compassion to his mother, Mary, to his beloved friend John. But in all of the stories, we also see Jesus willing to accept help, just as he did when Simon of Cyrene carried his cross when he was no longer able to do it for himself. Jesus shows us a human being living the life that is unfolding before him, even in the most dire circumstances. Jesus shows us a man trusting that even if he can't see it at the time, there is still a reason to move forward. What a lesson for life this is. That even in the worst of times, we also might respond to what is happening without blaming others. That we might continue to move on in trust. And that we might not be too stubborn or proud to accept whatever help there is to be had. Who is Jesus Christ for me? And I can give you the orthodox answer. Perfect God and perfect man. We'll say it together in a little bit when we recite the creed. Completely God, completely man. Who is God for me? Who is Jesus for me? To go back to the words of the song, which spoke about not understanding how things could get so out of hand. For me, Jesus is the one who shows me the truth. That God can be trusted, even when there are things that we don't understand. And Jesus shows me the truth, that I and you will always still be okay, no matter how out of hand things get. I invite you to the beginning of this Holy Week, as we walk the way of Jesus, and see in his face and his footsteps God's great love for us and the persons God has created each of us to be.